Okay guys, before we were so rudely interrupted by my camera just cutting out on me. It's funny because when it goes off it just says bye-bye. It's at least pleasant of it to say that as it's leaving. Anyway, new day for me. It takes me a long time to get the camera charged back up again. Get my stuff uploaded as much as I possibly can. Anyway, today shout out and say hello to all my people in the Tuesday, Thursday 102. Isabella, Carissa, Megan, Anthony, Porter, Roman, Lisa, Diana, Luis, Jessica, Derek, Ashley, Kobe, Jennifer, Giovanni, Abigail, Cameron, Lene, Teresa, Nathan, Blanca, DeAndre, Trevor, Andrew, Chloe, Melia, Sean, Jose, Isabella, second one, Hendrik, Christiana, Brent, Katie, Gabriel, Matthew, Giddy, Sava, Hannah, Manuel, Alexandra, Lindsay, Amy, Colton, Sophia, and David Torres. How you doing, bud? Anyway, hope you guys are okay, hanging in there and doing well today. Okay, so what I was doing, I was telling you guys about the 1920s, and the 20s is the period of the triumph of the modern, and one extraordinary expression of that, of course, is what was happening to women. So my category, or my topic general, is just call it women drivers, so women in the driver's seats of their own lives. And the way that I'm going to present this to you guys is by using the flapper. But this was a good idea to hold all three of them at the same time, but it's not a good idea at all. To use the flapper as my representation, so that's our potential identification. You know, flapper represents women in the 1920s, and of course represents the triumph of the modern 1920s. And I told you that women were doing all kinds of interesting things in the 1920s. I've already told you, of course, that they were becoming politically active. That has to do with their voting, of course, but also organizing themselves and promoting things like the Equal Rights Amendment. I was in the middle, I think, of telling you about the economic activities, and I want you to know that more women were going to college. It becomes an exciting part of the 1920s, and the end result of that is that there were more women professionals in the 1920s than ever before. So these are women who have college educations who are going into particular professions. Now, when you hear the professions of the 1920s for women, there's a little bit of a stereotyping type thing that's going on here. At least, I hear that. Okay, so we find that there were more women who were becoming authors and editors and journalists. There were more women who were becoming artists and art teachers. There were more women that were becoming musicians and music teachers. A little bit stereotypical, but there were also more women becoming professors. So just there's a range of professional activities that were taking place. Although in reality, the dominant professions emerging in the 1920s that become essentially stereotypical even to this day, as the women were absolutely dominating teaching, especially on the elementary school level, and also nursing. Nursing. And by the way, kudos of course to our healthcare people. I cannot believe just how difficult that must be for them, and just their amazing effort, their heroic efforts. We will remember those things forever, I think. Anyway. So we have women going to college. We have women also becoming professionals, and that becomes kind of the hallmark of what the flapper activity was all about. Most of the women, though, who were economically active were not professionals. They were moving into the service industry, service sector essentially. But this becomes something that was kind of new in its own particular kind of way. So two occupations that today seem absolutely stereotypical for women were new in the 1920s. And one of them was waiting, being a waitress. Now, the notion of a woman waiting tables is not exactly new. If you go back to the Middle Ages, you would find the serving wench, who would be there in terms of the inn and tavern. But to be honest with you, waiting tables basically was a male profession. And all of a sudden, of course, women began to move into this profession. Now, there was a true hierarchy. So the fancier the restaurant, there's almost absolutely sure you're going to have a male waiter. But in the diners, and the diners were kind of like the emerging fast food of the 1920s, it was women who were doing the waitressing. So that occupation is opening up in a major way. Also, the secretary. Secretary is actually a fairly common, it's a new phenomenon, it's a 20th century phenomenon. In the 19th century, secretaries would have been scriveners. This is like Bob Cratchit, who would write out all the business of whatever, if they were working for a lawyer or something like that. And these guys were, of course, renowned for their penmanship. I could have been one. You guys know that I have extraordinarily fine penmanship, too. But, what happened is, along comes the 20th century, and a couple of things are going on here. And one is the emergence of the typewriter. So the typewriter is the industrial application, of course, in terms of writing things out. And intriguingly, the scriveners thought it was beneath them. They didn't, it's too mundane to do that kind of, okay? And so the men were like refusing to do the typewriter, but the women were more than willing to do this. And the other big thing that happened was World War I, and World War I just demanded so much paperwork. And they hired lots of women to come in to begin to do all the clerical activities. So all of a sudden, women as secretaries is emerging big time as far as the 1920s are concerned. Also, women working in the retail generally as shop girls and clerks and things like that, and women serving women, of course, as hairdressers, doing the manis and the petties and all that kind of fun stuff. So you see a significant expansion of the number of women who are working in the American economy. By 1930, women represented about 20% of the industrial labor force, and the workforce, I should say, not industrial, the workforce. And that's nothing. Today it's over 50%, but it's this suggestion of a climb, of a transformation that beginning to happen as women were becoming more and more economically active. The flappers had jobs. The flappers were becoming more economically active. Now, of all the things the flappers did, though, the most interesting are the behavioral changes that are going to take place here. And that's the thing that we sort of know the flappers for. Their attitudes and behaviors become kind of the paramount expression that's going on here. So one thing that I'm going to suggest to you is that, I guess the first issue that I always like to think of is, what is sexual equality? I mean, how does that manifest basically? What will it mean? I think that you would have to go along with me here and suggest that we haven't achieved it yet. And I always wonder, when we have achieved it, what will it look like? And I think there's obvious kind of things that it will look like. It will look like equal pay for women as men. Women still are making only about 78% of the amount of money that a man who's got the same job is making, okay? So that's got to equal out. Equal number of women and men, or proportional numbers of women and men as CEOs of major corporations. Of course, a woman president, that would be a powerful indication. If not that, then, proportional representation in our governments, state governments and national government. There should be at least 50% of the representatives are women, and maybe a little bit more, 51%, if we really represent the population. So those are at least indications of what equality will look like, and what else, ever else there will be, I don't know. I'm intrigued by what this will ultimately mean. But it's also interesting to kind of look historically at, what have women done to kind of try to achieve equality. And what happened in the 1920s is that women tried to get what men had, okay? And, it's a problematic kind of measure of equality, but it's functional, okay? So what men were able to do, then women should be able to do also. Now, I'm going to call this lowest common denominator equality. And what I mean by that is that, you want to do what men can do, but men often do sort of problematic things. If you want to be like men, you almost got to come down to our level. And it's not that it doesn't make sense; it does make sense. But the kind of things the women did in the 1920s, it kind of had come down to the level of what the men were doing. So the way I'm going to describe this for you is that women began to enter into what we might call the male prerogative zone. My dog is barking because the pool guy's here to do the pool. The male prerogative zone. So that means that women started to do what men had been doing for a long time. And just to give you a sense of, what do I mean by this? And so, for instance, if men have Playboy magazine, then equality manifests as women having Playgirl magazine. If men have female strippers, then by God, women should have Chippendales or the Thunder from Down Under or something like that. So this is the kind of equality, and it's not wrong, but it's not. It's this interesting manifestation of the dynamics of equality. So what am I trying to tell you? What were women doing in the 1920s? Well, men had been smoking forever. I mean, that was just sort of perceived as in the male prerogative zone, and public smoking, of course. In fact, it was excessive in many ways, how much they were smoking in those days. Now, there probably were women who did smoke. There's evidence that women, even elite women in the Gilded Age period did smoke, but it was kind of a hidden behavior. They would never smoke in public, and they would never smoke often in front of their husband or something like that. But one of the things that women would start to do in the 1920s is they'd start to smoke, So you've come a long way, babe, with your Virginia Slims. And I hope you understand that, that's an interesting dynamic of equality, because that means that women will begin to develop lung cancer and chronic pulmonary disease and all those other kind of fun things that, are associated with smoking. But indeed, women did begin to smoke in the 1920s, and they could smoke in public, okay? Men had been drinking forever, drinking alcohol, of course, and you all know that women had been drinking alcohol too, but the Victorian era was a very prescribed era for women's behavior, especially middle class and upper middle class women. And basically every single woman was supposed to be a teetotaler. That's the way it was, they were supposed to roll, essentially. Well, in the 1920s, and I kind of suggested to you this already when I discussed Prohibition, women started drinking, and hallelujah, women get to get drunk. Women get to become alcoholics. Women get to develop cirrhosis of the liver, So, and I'm not going to say this is wrong. I mean, it's totally legitimate that if men should have something they can do, women should be able to do the same kind of thing. But we do have kind of, these kind of, women moving into the male prerogative zone. Another thing that women did in the 1920s was they went to bars. I already told you they went to the speakeasies. In the 19th century, basically, the image is that the only women you would ever see in a bar, saloon, or tavern was a fallen woman, a prostitute, or someone like that, And indeed, the movies, the westerns would make fun of, this could be a fun part of the movie where the men are all in the saloon or something like that, and the school mom busts through those, double door things, whatever they are. And everyone's going, oh my God, a woman's in the bar. This would have been an exceptional situation, of course. But in the 1920s, women are going to bars, and why not? And this is the thing that men have been able to do kind of forever. This is, this was the male prerogative zone, essentially. So women smoking, women drinking, women going to bars, all of these were kind of moving into the generalized area of the male prerogative zone. And on the bottom there, women began to express their sexuality. Men had been able to be sexual. Why should women be able to do the same kind of thing? That was part of the generalized flapper experience. This is, here again, it's kind of a reflection on the Victorian era. Victorian, very prescribed, so that means that the behaviors of women are being told to them in a kind of, pronounced way. And the general notion of the Victorian era was a woman was an asexual being. So, a woman is not a sexual being. A woman tolerates sex because of procreation, but women are not necessarily, sex is not something that they would want. That seemed unseemly in some particular kind of way. And of course the problem in so much is the double standard that men are sexual beings and they're supposed to get their, do their sexual appetite wherever they want to, and women are not, basically. Well, there's two things that are going to transform that attitude essentially into the 20th century, and one of them is Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud is going to come out with his psychology, saying that sexual repression is going to lead to all kinds of things. He would have talked about hysteria, which you and I would call anxiety. He would have talked about melancholia, which you and I would call depression. But he thought that women should, express their sexuality because otherwise they were repressing it, and that's going to cause all kinds of difficulty. And the other thing is Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger's coming along and saying, you can have sex without having a baby. So these two things will begin to create a liberation for women in the 1920s. And we see the flapper is increasingly a sexual person, of course, having sex, more often having sex perhaps, out of wedlock, things that would have been, of course, incredibly frowned upon. I don't know how far we can take this. I don't think we should go too far. There were clearly very liberated flappers who were doing whatever they wanted to do, but I'm imagining still that the vast majority of especially middle class and upper middle class women felt some restricted, but maybe more able to do more things than they had done before, of course, but still feeling somewhat restricted, at least in their sexual behaviors. Nothing like that would happen, in the sexual revolutions of the 1960s or the later part of the 20th century. Anyway, so these are these behavioral changes that are taking place, and another real symbol of the flapper situation was the way that they decided to kind of liberate themselves in terms of their clothing. So this is my lame effort here. Here are some flappers, of course, dressed in their interesting flapper outfits. What they were doing was, and if you guys want to see more of these, of course, you just search that, and you're going to run into so much flapper stuff you can't believe it. Flapper fashions, of course, even resonate to some degree to this day. The Victorian era, again, this hyper-prescribed era, for middle-class, upper-middle-class women. And among the prescriptions were basically total body coverage. So in its firmest suggestion, that meant from the top of the neck, so not even the bottom of the neck, but the top of the neck, to the wrists, to the ankles, total coverage of the female form, of course, and not just that, but like multiple petticoats and things like that would be part of the apparatus that you would wear. Now the irony of this, of course, is total body coverage, but then a hyper accentuation of the female form. So you can't see any of the body, but you hyper accentuate it with the clothing that you're wearing. So among other things that they would do, and there's just sort of a madness in this kind of situation, they would put the bustle on. So the bustle is actually this contraption that would extend your butt, make your butt look even bigger than it was essentially. And whenever I think about that, I always think, how do you sit down with the damn thing? I have to tell you that I was one time in a tour of a 19th century home, a 19th century mansion. Had a really fun tour guide, what can I say, the docent that was there. And for whatever reason, he decided he would use me to model the, I already forgot the thing. And I'm quite embarrassed, but of course kind of excited to get to wear that first time in my entire life. It wasn't just the, damn it, I forgot what it's called. I just said it to you. Not just that, but also the hoop skirts, So these skirts that would just, and that became kind of a mania too. And at the end of the 18th century, English women, the kind of, and this is almost heading into the year, a little before the year of Jane Austen, but they would wear these monumental hoop skirts that would go out, I think at the peak, and part of this was, it was like a mania to get it as wide as you could. They were 10 feet across, you could have a whole family of people walking underneath your skirt as you go down the sidewalks. The sidewalks at Bath in England are very wide because of these hoop skirts essentially. And those were at least expressions of the hyper accentuation of the female form, but the classic one of course was the corset. So for however many years, and we're talking centuries, I think it was maybe 300 years, women wore corsets around their midsection, of course. And they were made out of whalebone and other kind of materials. And the idea was to squeeze the woman down to an ideal waist, And this is real, almost to the Barbie doll kind of situation of a 20-inch waist or even a 19-inch waist. Some women would break their rib bone so that they could, the corset could squeeze even more so. And all I can tell you, this had to be really bad for their health. We don't breathe really up here in our up on the top of our lungs. Your good breathing is your diaphragm breathing. And if you squeeze off the diaphragm breathing, then you think, oh my God, how's this person even going to sustain themselves, essentially? Women would often, in very excitable moments, they would faint. And of course, the rationale was that this was simply because, that they were the weaker sex and they couldn't handle what's going on. And all I can think of is because they weren't a damn corset, something exciting happens, you start breathe a little high, and then all of a sudden you faint because you just can't get a full breath, So anyway, what happened in the 1920s was that the flappers began to reject all of this. The the total body coverage, that's going to go by the way. As we see the hemlines rising. Now, if you look at the picture I provided you, it really isn't, they're not really going to miniskirts just yet, okay? The hemlines were generally moving up to about the knee. But I have to tell you, that was quite remarkable. Men had not seen women's legs for centuries. Women's legs in public had just sort of disappeared, basically. And I don't know if this is the case, but I always think this is funny. In the 18th century, when the men would wear the culottes, the breeches that they would wear, and then they would wear this is the elites primarily, they would wear their fine silk stockings. Because the only legs that they had to look at were men's legs, they would admire, fine turn of calf, my man, and that kind of stuff, All of a sudden in the 1920s, men could begin to, if they wanted to, they could look at women's legs for the first time. Now, the hemlines did come up to about the knee, and so really the mini skirt, you can't necessarily ascribe that to the flappers, though when they got into their dancing dresses, sometimes they would be fringed or they would be slit up to the thigh, and when they kicked up their heels and stuff, you are actually for the first time seeing part of a woman's thigh in terms of what they're wearing. So not exactly the miniskirt era, but heading a little bit in that kind of direction. So the hemlines came up, the necklines began to go down. Now, one thing I think is very interesting is that you see a pendulum swing here. So the Victorian era, the classic hourglass figure, of course, based upon the corset, bustle, that's what the damn thing was, the bustle. But based upon the corset, what the flappers decided to do was go with a straight look. And you actually can see it in these dresses. The whole idea was to sort of de-emphasize the female form and make a kind of very straight look. And in fact, in the de-emphasis, if you were maybe too busty, the women they bind their breasts down. They're trying to get that classic flat look if they possibly could, even if that meant that they had to bind themselves in some way. So it's weird how, you swing a little too far sometimes, Anyway, so the clothing styles were relaxed tremendously, and thank God for even the bathing suit. It seems like those Victorian bathing suits were something designed to drown you. All this clothing that you're going to wear to go dip into the sea or something like that seemed like a bad idea. Women in the 1920s wore something that looked kind of like a wetsuit, like a mid-thigh wetsuit or something like that, where you you'd go out there, not spaghetti straps, wider straps, but at least, a little bit more of what we would consider kind of a viable bathing suit than what they used to wear in the Victorian period. Women also began to cut their hair. This was a total prescription of the Victorian period. The women never cut their hair, so you would imagine there were many, many women with hair that was just super long. I have a feeling that at some point, of course, they having to trim their ends and stuff like that. But what I find is so interesting is that on the one hand, they never cut their hair. On the other hand, though, they never go out in public with their hair down. So to let your hair down was considered to be a sign of intimacy, something you would only do in your own boudoir and only with the people that you were intimate with. So whenever you walked outside, hair is up, And, you go from really the kind of very stark, super tight buns and hairdo and braids and things like that they did like at the time of the Civil War, to later in the Gilded Age, you kind of begin to relax that look, the Gibson girl look, where a little fuzzier, but still up, fuzzier. Well, anyway, the flappers said, to hell with this, we're done with the whole thing, and they start to cut their hair, and they would do the bobbed look, so bob, not really good about this, but maybe bangs across here and bobbing around, cutting kind of straight off around your neck. Some of them even went with a boyish look, where their hair looked, Amelia Earhart, if you check her out, her hair looks a little too much like my haircut for my comfort. I don't know how she would feel about the whole thing, but anyway, this is what an Amelia Earhart haircut kind of looks like, so the boyish look. So this was, again, a sense of liberation. You're liberating your body from the constraints of the Victorian era. Anyway, so these women, one thing I need to say is they began to wear makeup. And I just think that that's really interesting. In the Victorian era, respectable women never wore makeup. Makeup was something that was only used by prostitutes and actresses, so they're the ones who used makeup. But in the 1920s, women decided, this was something that they wanted to do. So makeup becomes much more foundation of an industry and a consumer society, if you think about it, sort of critical part of the whole story. There's a book that was famous that came out this year and that became a movie called Cheaper by the Dozen. And it's a family with 12 kids, and they're kind of having to deal with the issues in the 1920s. But I'll never forget one of the scenes where the teenage girl has gone out with friends and she put on mascara, just mascara. And she comes home and her mom just slaps the crap out of her, kind of suggesting, both the fact that changes are taking place, but also that the old guard would struggle, of course, with anything like this. Now, as I told you before, and I've lost my little thing here, as the flappers are being considered by the larger population, by the establishment, they were often perceived as being promiscuous and irresponsible women. I mean, this is the negative image that was presented by the establishment in terms of the flappers. But I want you guys to know, here's our significance, of course. The flapper was a modern, liberated woman. I mean, she's actually beginning to transform the world for herself, of course, and for many other people, basically. And, this is, the 20s is this kind of really important first step towards women's liberation in the 20th century. And of course, very many more important things are going to happen in the aftermath of that. I'm going to take a break right here because I need to set up for the next section, and I'll be right back.